Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, analyze and understand the articles which are relevant for your examination, be it for the prelims or for the mains exam, and also understand the larger context due to which they are being discussed, what is the backdrop, and we will analyze the portions relevant for your exam without going into the tangential discussion associated with other useless areas. Now, having said that, all those who are preparing for the examination for 2026, who are going to appear for the examination and want to go for a serious preparation, we understand that you do require various guidance for the different subjects and you all must have different requirements. If you are interested in being guided by India's top educators, getting guidance through the best test series which is available, the answer writing practice, the prelims test series practice, do fill out the form which is provided in the description below and thereby beat the competition by taking this decisive stage and step for preparation. Now, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss for today. So today in total, we are going to have a discussion for around 10 topics, slightly in brief in certain areas and in detail wherever required. Now, India-Canada expel diplomats. Now, this is a news story which is being building up since yesterday. Now, this has appeared in page 1 of the international edition of the newspaper. And this is basically an ongoing tussle between India and Canada since last year. Now, this has taken a dramatic turn today or yesterday, and that is something we are going to discuss briefly. Ensuring a proper security net for gig workers. The conditions for working and health benefits, other security benefits, social security benefits for the gig workers. So, what are the provisions and what is it that needs to be done going ahead? So this is going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. Then, taking guard. This is again an editorial piece which has been written owing to RBI's Monetary Policy Committee's action to hold the policy rates without going for a cut or without going for an increase in the policy rates. While increase was not expected, but one of the members of Monetary Policy Committee favored a cut in the interest rates. So thereby RBI has taken a cautionary stance. And why is that the case? So this has again appeared in the editorial section relevant for your GS paper 3. On Samsung workers' right to unionize. Now, this is about the trade unions and an ongoing strike and an ongoing Bandh call which has been carried out in Sriperumbudur and the state police action against the workers and the protesting workers, how that has instigated a lot of various different opinions all around. So what is that aspect of collective bargain? We are going to take a look into that, the legal aspects associated also. Relevant for GS3. Then, how did the Haber-Bosch process change the world? This is about a kind of a question from science, but can be asked in environment ecology as well about the nitrogen cycle. The importance of nitrogen when it comes to availability of nutrients for the plant growth and what was the role of Haber-Bosch in that. So that is again relevant for your GS paper 3. And few of the articles we are going to discuss briefly for the prelims perspective. Nobel in economics for work in wealth inequality has been declared. September retail inflation has hit a 9-month high, and you will have to interrelate these two particular stories. That this is one of the reasons why the Monetary Policy Committee has held the rates. India-Russia discussed training of sailors for polar navigation. Stubble burning on the rise in Punjab and Haryana, and Nile nations agree on water sharing without Egypt's nod. So these are the articles that we are going to discuss today. And at the end of the discussion, I advise you to go to the Telegram page, the Telegram channel, and take a look at the quiz which can be made and which has been made from these particular topics, so as to understand what is your overall assessment level and understanding level with the articles in discussion, and also the kind of questions that you can expect UPSC to be asking out of this. So without further ado, let us start the discussion with the first topic of the day, and that is Niger case. India, Canada expelled diplomats. Now, Indo-Canadian relationship have been in turmoil is one of the moderate ways of putting Indo-Canadian relationship for the past year and a half. All of this had been triggered ever since you had the killing of Niger in Canada. Now, Canadian officials have been saying from that point of time that there has been an explicit role or an implicit role of Indian government officials and Indian officials at the various different roles and functionaries in executing that particular murder. Now, India on its side has been demanding action from Canada for a long period of time, owing to the fact that Canada has been sheltering various different types of separatist tendencies within its land, and Canada has been harboring those particular interests which end up damaging India both in the short as well as the long run. Now, this involves people who basically are involved in smuggling, human trafficking, kidnapping cases, murder cases, and also riling up separatist tendencies and separatist values and preaching through the larger expatriate community which is settled in Canada, Britain, and so on. So India has always been warning Canada that these particular anti-social elements, while they might be a vote catcher for the Canadian government as of now, but they are not in the long-term interest of India and India's sovereignty. And Canadian officials have always turned a deaf ear for that, traditionally. That, okay, let them protest, let them hold out rallies for free Khalistan and so on. We will allow this to happen under the garb of free speech. That means Canada and the Canadian authorities, in a way, are saying that whatever has been happening there, in terms of the Khalistani movement, in terms of the separatist tendencies, they won't bring any curb to that, owing to the fact that it is free speech. Now, the same metric, the same parameter does not stand true when you had various different protests in Canada which have been going, because the Trudeau government has been losing its public popularity. And there have been, in the past year and a half, there have been massive protests, first of all from the truckers and the truckers union, then from the educators, then you also had the climate activists again protesting. Now, in all those protests, the Canadian government and the Canadian authorities came down very hard on the protesters. At that point of time, that crucible of free speech, or that particular parameter of free speech, was not held to be important. But when it comes to the Khalistan movement, when it comes to holding rallies across the various different regions of Canada, celebrating the assassination of our ex-Prime Minister, that is when Canadian authorities put up the flag of free speech. Now, this has riled up Indian authorities for quite a long time. Having said that, when this allegation was leveled and made against India, this was at its peak in the G20 summit, which was hosted by India. Now, at that point of time, Justin Trudeau went public with this particular kind of allegation. And he said that he had evidences. So, India being a responsible member of the Committee of Nations, India asked for those particular evidences to be shared. But then, those evidences have not been shared. As per the information given out by Ministry of External Affairs, none of those evidences have been shared by the Indian government. Now, this was the backdrop. But then, what triggered this action? So, you had a recent public statement by Justin Trudeau, where he said that Indian authorities are again to blame for Niger's killing and Niger's murder. And it is the duty of the Canadian government to protect the lives of the Canadian citizens from other external outside forces. Now, this is largely being seen even in Canadian circles as Trudeau trying to rile up that national sentiment and national fervor in order to gain some public sympathy and votes. Having said that, the Canadian authorities also basically made a request, or rather issued a directive to the Indian government to declare all the embassy officials as person of interest. Now, what happens when you declare an individual as a person of interest? Let's suppose there's an investigation which is going on. Now, in that particular investigation, if let's suppose there is a murder investigation which is going on, as is the case with the Nijjar killing. Now, there would be certain number of suspects out there. Now, those suspects are declared as person of interest. But then, all the members of the Indian embassy, including the High Commissioner, now High Commissioner has been a serving diplomat for 36 years. Now, those have been declared as person of interest. But then, all the members of the diplomatic community posted in the embassies, they are given or provided with an immunity against these criminal charges. Owing to the norms under the Vienna Convention, they are provided with diplomatic immunity. Now, Canadian authorities requested to the Indian government that you waive off that diplomatic immunity that has been provided to the officials. Now, that would open the door for arrests. So, Indian High Commissioner could have been arrested. So, India did not waive that diplomatic immunity. And the Ministry of External Affairs stood firm and said that this is preposterous. This is a kind of an allegation which is suited or which is aimed at assuaging and fulfilling the sentiment of the local population, the local vote bank, and a particular party which is a coalition partner of the Trudeau government, which is having a large amount of Sikh votes in Canada. So that is where the entire allegation has gone back and forth. Now, as a response to that, India has virtually called back all its various different embassy officials. Canada on its side has said that we have expelled and suspended these particular Indian diplomats. India on its side has suspended and expelled the various different Canadian diplomats and has given them a time till Sunday to leave the country. So this is an escalation in the ongoing conflict. And this is the first time that Ministry of External Affairs has come on public platform and has issued a statement that this is for local political purpose that Trudeau is doing. It is for the first time that the ministry has also stated that right from his first visit in 2018, Justin Trudeau has always ended up aiming to assuage his own vote bank rather than improving Indo-Canadian relationship. That has been the charges leveled. Now, Justin Trudeau has doubled down and has issued a statement few hours back where he said that again, the same rhetoric, that safety of Canadian citizens is the prime objective, is the prime agenda, and international law should follow. But India has been demanding evidences. India has pointed out to the fact that many of the immigrants who have gone through official channels, who have gone through proper channels, including students, including professionals, while they face some amount of time lag in getting that residency status in Canada, but many of such people with nefarious kind of intentions who can fuel separatism, who are involved in human trafficking, who are involved in drug smuggling, their entire request for citizenship and residency status has been expedited. That means those people are given that residency and refuge in Canada at a priority level. So this basically means that Canada is harboring anti-India sentiments and no government can support that. So that is the ongoing issue. Now, what will be the fallout of this, the outcome or the fallout? So here, or we refer to as the impact. First of all, the ties, Indo-Canadian ties, for some continuous amount of time are going to see a downhill. Now, even the new Canadian government, which is slated to replace Justin Trudeau, now even the new Canadian government will find it very hard to basically upturn or undo the domestic politics and the domestic triggering that Justin Trudeau has done. So here, the ties go downhill from here. Now, this will impact the student community, because you have a lot of students from India going to Canada to pursue their higher studies. So they will be impacted, and there will be a larger sentimental issue created between India and Canada, which will never be good for the diaspora as well. Then after that, rise in smuggling, trafficking, etc. For example, let's suppose, in order to fulfill the sentiments of his domestic constituency, Justin Trudeau continues to tread on the path of providing a safe refuge to those separatists, to the antisocial elements, etc. Even in the news, the Lawrence Bishnoi gang has got a significant amount of its offshoot present in Canada. So that can further deteriorate the social situation in our country, and the enforcement of law and order will also be impacted. Then even the existing diaspora will be impacted. The trade ties will take a downturn. Trade ties will take a significant amount of downturn. But you see, when we talk about Canada, people-to-people relationship is a major factor there. Trade is not that big a factor, because Indo-Canadian trade is still something which had not reached its optimum potential. So while the trade ties and other factors are not that overburdening, it is the ties with the diaspora that is going to be damaging in the long run. So what is the way forward? India has to maintain its stance, and as the Ministry of External Affairs has said, that just naming the senior most serving diplomat of India who is present or who is located in Canada, he has been named as person of interest, and India has basically termed it as preposterous, and that is a right stance. You have to defend your own diplomats who have a proven track record of integrity. Now, you cannot allow the domestic politics of a country to hover above and hover over the actions of the diplomats. So while India has been firm enough and has been correct in that, but the aspect of the evidences, now Canada has not managed to share any evidence whatsoever. So that is something that India can virtually highlight it to the global community as well, that we are a responsible member of the Committee of the Nations. We are vying for the status of the superpower, and this is something which we take very responsibly. So India has to come forward vociferously and argue its case that we are not at wrong here. Just because an anti-Indian element has been killed does not mean we have done that. And India needs to voice its opinion very strongly, as the ministry has done yesterday. Okay? Now, but this is a new story which is building, which will continue to build up throughout the day and tomorrow as well. We are going to come out with a detailed video with regards to the Indo-Canadian relationship and the down spiral. So do watch our YouTube channel for that. Now, ensuring a proper social safety net for the gig workers. Now, who are gig workers, or what do we understand when we refer to the gig economy? So gig workers are a kind of non-permanent freelance workers. The people that you see, the cab drivers for Ola, Uber, or let's suppose your delivery agents for Zomato, Swiggy, etc. Now, those are the individuals who work on a part-time basis, on a freelancing basis. They don't have the exact employer-employee relationship between the aggregators such as Swiggy, Zomato, Uber, Ola, etc. They don't have that exact and perfectly crafted employer-employee relationship. So these gig workers, basically, they are denied various different rights that the normal employees get. For example, rights of health insurance, retirement saving corpus, and other social security benefits as well. They are not provided with that. On the other hand, these aggregators, they end up finding various different means in order to exploit them. Now, the prime purpose is not that the aggregators will sit together and how to exploit the gig workers and they work out a plan. No. What happens is that because you don't have a perfectly crafted employee contract or an employer contract, so that gives a lot of legroom for these aggregators to impose extra working hours without extra pay, to suddenly change the parameters of pay, suddenly change the conditionalities of work, to be able to punish those particular gig workers or those particular workers in a kind of a non-tangible manner. For example, people won't get new bookings itself. People, for the work they have done, they won't get adequate money. So the gig workers, they are at a loss. Now, understand the importance of these gig workers before we get into the context of this entire discussion. These gig workers, they are a vital cog in the machinery of our service sector. Now, India is a country which had largely been dependent on the private sector, on the primary sector. Primary sector such as agriculture, mining, fisheries, etc. Even today, your primary sector employs around 45% to 50% of our labor force, which is huge. For a country which is trying to develop and trying to grow significantly, that is overburdened primary sector. Manufacturing sector has never picked up so significantly. So services sector is the one which holds the potential to increase our per capita income. Now, in this services sector, gig workers, they get some amount of meaningful income and meaningful employment. But then, that while it holds a good opportunity for the future, it has got that kind of a drawback of also having significant detrimental impact for the workers, right, if they are exploited. Now, there has been a long time since this issue has been raised by various different activists, worker unions, etc. Now, just prior to the election, state elections I am talking about, before the Rajasthan state elections, Rajasthan passed a gig worker legislation for ensuring benefits to the gig workers. Then even in the case of Karnataka, you had a similar electoral cycle. After that, you basically had the gig workers, the legislation which was passed, which tells you something, that these gig workers, they form a large number of a very valuable vote bank for the legislators. So, legislators are concerned, but they are unable to provide that particular help to the gig workers. So let us understand that why this has come in news once again. And before that, the prime reason for the exploitation of the gig workers, the prime reason that despite the legislation passed by Karnataka Assembly, by the Rajasthan Assembly, they are not getting the rights, is because of the proper definition of employee and employer between the gig workers and the aggregators. So, the Union Ministry of Labor and Employment is drafting a national law to incorporate gig workers into social security schemes. That is why this has been in news. Now, this is going to be an overarching law for the betterment of the gig workers. Now, what is this law going to involve? So, this law basically will require the aggregators. When we talk about the aggregators such as Ola, Swiggy, etc., they have to provide 1 to 2% of the revenue for Social Security Fund. Social Security Fund of the gig workers. Now, this Social Security Fund will go into providing health insurance, other various different benefits such as retirement corpus, etc. So it will be required for health insurance, retirement corpus, etc. Okay, that is the larger aim. So they have to basically put in that 1 to 2% of the revenue. Now here, this would also basically involve the development of worker welfare boards. So you will have, as per the law has not been drafted yet, but it is in the drafting stage, but what information has come out. So basically, you will also have the model of the welfare board. Now this welfare board, what it will do? It will take a look into the rights of these workers in particular. And when we talk about this welfare board, overall you will observe that this will involve registration of workers, transparency in automated systems. Automated system as in, let's suppose the software that is being used to allocate work and services to the gig workers. Now there will be transparency maintained, because the gig workers always had an allegation that in case some of them, they do not agree to overwork without extra pay, then they are punished by the aggregators in the way that they say that the software is not providing you with the services. So these automated systems, if the parameters change, there has to be transparency. So transparency in automated systems. Then 14-day notice period by the aggregators for termination. Now these are the various aspects which have been suggested, which have been recommended as per the law. Okay. Now here you will observe that when you talk about this national law for the gig workers overall, the development of the national law. Now, how is it going to be different from the state legislation which has already been passed? Basically, this is going to be an overarching mechanism which will be enacted across the country. But you have to understand that we have already gone through this path. The government had already declared in 2019 and 2020 the updated labor codes. Now these labor codes meant to simplify the various different labor laws in our country, which creates a lot of conundrum, creates a lot of dispute overall, and the lack of labor rights. So the labor codes in 2019 and 2020 were simplified. Right. Now that was done in order to facilitate the rights of the workers. So very briefly, the labor codes of 2019 and 2020. Codes of 2019 and 2020. What they did, they basically decluttered and grouped into all the various different, in a way you can say, entangled labor laws. The labor laws which had a lot of duplication, the labor laws which were too detailed in order to find any particular meaningful purpose. So that all those detailed labor laws were simplified under 4 broader headings. Which were those? So you had wage, social security, then industrial relation, and also working conditions or occupational safety. Now you see, for the gig workers, the aspect of wage, social security, and even the industrial relation, they can be valid, provided the definition of the gig worker is something which is clear. Now, gig workers even today, how they have been declared, that comes into the category of informal workers, informal sector. And that means many of the benefits that can be given to them, that is denied. So under the new law which is being proposed, it is also being proposed that the workers, the gig workers, will be registered under the e-Shram portal of the ministry to give them the required benefits. Now that is the same with the migrant laborers as well, the informal sector laborers. Just to give you an idea, let's suppose an individual who is working for Swiggy, let's suppose. Now that individual is working for Swiggy just like any other employee would work for an employer, but he is treated as an informal worker. So what does that mean? Now at the time, for example, a simple case which has also been given in the article, during pregnancy. Now if you are a formal employee, you are provided with a benefit of 26 weeks of paid leave, maternity benefits, etc. Now that is something which is as per the global benchmarks. But if on the other hand you are an informal worker and you are registered in the e-Shram portal, you will be given a monetary benefit of rupees 5,000, 10,000, etc. There is a huge gap. If you are a formal worker, the aspect of hiring and firing takes place in a much more organized manner. If you are held or deemed to be an informal worker, then all your social security and rights, they go out of the window. So here, what is the crux that we can extract from all this discussion? That it is not a new law which is needed. It is not the new division of power which is needed. What is required is a proper definition of what do you understand by gig work. They should never be held as informal or migrant laborers. So that is where this particular legislation, the law which is going to come into place, they have to work specifically for creation of a better definition. So when we talk about way forward, which is important, so here the definition of migrant, definitions of migrant and gig workers need to be specified. And now we have global standards as well, global examples as well. You had a US court in a similar kind of a dispute between Uber and one of its employees, declared Uber as an employer and the driver as an employee. So it was not the aspect of the informal sector anymore. So if Uber in its home ground is being treated as an employer, the driver as an employee, why not Uber in India should be dealt with the same parameter? So that is when the role of aggregators. Now, aggregator as a term in itself means they are basically bereft of many of the accountabilities. So that has to be replaced by employers. So rather than aggregators, the term aggregators, one has to use employers. The employer-employee relationship has to be maintained. Then after that, registration on the portal has to be made mandatory. Registration on e-Shram portal, which is presently maintained only for the informal sector. That should be done even for gig workers, so that they have an accountability. You have a maintenance of record, right, on e-Shram portal. And strict enforcement, a mandatory health security coverage, medical security, then a mandatory retirement corpus, their contribution. So that is when you will have the employees also working with greater heart and greater efficiency. India is a service sector dominant economy. Majority of our economic contribution comes from the services sector. Close to around 60% and more of the contribution to GDP is coming from service and the allied sector. So we cannot have the services sector being plagued because of the ill treatment of the workers working there. So that is something you have to understand and write in the way forward. So let us take a look at the practice question. A sustainable growth in service sector requires a welfare net for the gig workers. In the context of the above statement, analyze the issues faced by gig workers in India and suggest a way forward. So what do you do in this? In the introduction, you basically talk about the definition of the gig workers. Who are these gig workers? That is basically, so they work on a freelance basis and they work part-time in many of the cases for aggregators and various different services sector. Now, then the gig workers, then when you talk about the body, there you have to talk about the role of gig workers in the services sector. So that is the role that you have to talk about. In the ever expanding services sector and contribution to economy, the gig workers form an important part of the entire machine. And they contribute not only in terms of further extending or enabling the services sector to perform, but also create demand in the market. So that is where the gig economy is also one of the areas where employment can be found. Low skilled jobs can also be found. So that is the role, that is the benefit. Now what are the issues faced? So prolonged work hours, extra work without extra pay, all these issues you have to highlight, lack of social security net, etc. And then in the remaining portion you have to provide a way forward to include them into the proper formal environment, to talk about their rights. For that, a national legislation, enforcement by the state bodies and the state governments, the change of norm from aggregator to employer, all of that you can mention. In the conclusion, you can talk about that India, with its vast demography, cannot foresee an advancement in the coming decades without the rights of the gig worker, because majority of the employment in the coming decades is going to shift to gig economy. Not only for the aggregators, but even for, let's suppose, tech services, even for, let's suppose, the other digital services. You will have professionals, trained professionals, who would rather choose to freelance rather than going for a kind of an employer-employee relationship. So their right needs to be protected. Only then can we truly transition into a high-income economy. Okay? Now, the third article, relevant for your GS paper 3, very briefly though. So this talks about the fact that the Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, of the RBI has held the benchmark interest rate. It has not decreased the benchmark interest rate. Now here, very briefly, even though you would have covered it earlier, but when we talk about the interest rates, we are basically talking about rates such as the repo rate. Now, that is the rate at which, let's suppose, the central bank provides money to the other commercial banks, etc. Or that will also impact the rate at which you take various different loans. The banks provide credit. For that, the interest rates are important. Now, there is always a pressure on the central bank, that is the RBI in this case, to lower the interest rates. Why? Because if, let's suppose, the interest rates have been lowered or are lowered, that means what? It will always end up increasing the money supply in the economy. As the money supply will increase, means the banks will have more money. When the banks have more money, they will lend more. People like you and me, we will borrow more, because now the loans are available at very cheap rates because the interest rates have gone down. So once the money supply increases, the demand in the economy overall increases. Because if we are able to, let's suppose, get a car loan at a very cheap price, that means what? Mostly we will go and buy the car, which earlier we could not. So the demand in the economy always is healthy. Demand will increase. As the demand increases, this will lead to increase in production. Increase in production. As there is increase in production, there will be more job creation. The factories will increase the capacity, there will be more jobs. And that will further, if more people are finding jobs, that will create a virtuous cycle of more demand, and there's a kickstart that the economy gets. Having said that, there is also a kind of an unwanted outcome of this particular action. That is, once the demand increases, let's suppose there's a supply mismatch. That supply side cannot produce that much. Then immediately when people have more money, they will spend more, and if you don't have enough supply, this can also fuel inflation. Inflation can be triggered. Now you see, in a country or in a developed country like Japan or US, where the inflation rates are particularly low, around 1 to 2.5%, 3%. Now there some amount of inflation is required to fuel the economy. But in a developing country like India, where you still have a lot of people below poverty line, this is an absolute red line which should not be crossed. That is why the Monetary Policy Committee has to carry out a very calibrated balancing act between inflation and fueling growth. Because India requires low inflation and high growth. That is the requirement. So if you increase the interest rates, inflation can be brought down. Because that will lower the demand, inflation can be brought down. But if you increase the interest rates, growth will be sabotaged, because then people will borrow from somewhere else, invest somewhere else. So that is why this time's Monetary Policy Committee review, which was happening, they noticed that for the month of July, August, while the inflation numbers were already down, so there was an argument to lower the interest rates now. That if the interest rates are lowered, maybe that can fuel the demand and further the growth of Indian economy. Now RBI has maintained and has been proven right by the September data of inflation. The September data of inflation has increased quite dramatically. Now, owing to the festive season, again, if the inflation hits a higher mark, that is when a lowering of interest rate could have turned out to be counterproductive and people would have suffered much more. So that is where RBI is taking a cautionary stance, and it is now since April 2023. So it is a long time. April 2023, when the interest rates have been held to be stable and static at the same value. So this is where the article or the argument posted here talks about that yes, there has been a slight decline in the urban economy in our country. That is indicated by lowering of the car sales, the passenger vehicles, etc. Their growth has slightly tapered. But at the same time, it is also a reality that inflation can rise up owing to the various different challenges faced. So that is where RBI in the month of February now will take a renewed stance about the interest rates, going with the fact that if the inflation is under control, that is around 4.5%, then RBI can take a lowering of the interest rate. So here, what do you have to extract? The value of the interest rate? Absolutely not. The numbers associated? Absolutely not. What you have to extract from this for your exam is the relationship between the interest rates, the aspect of money supply, growth, and inflation. This is the chart and the table that you have to understand, that how the variation of interest rate can end up impacting the economy. Now, the next article on Samsung workers' right to unionize. Now you see, for a long period. Now, we were talking about the workers' rights just now in the case of gig economy. Now, there has been another case, and this is in the outskirts of Chennai. So, the context of it is that Samsung India workers near Chennai are on strike for more than a month now. And around 1200 workers at Sri Perumbudur unit of Samsung Electronics have been on a strike since September 9, demanding better wages and working conditions. And also, they want recognition of their newly formed labor union, that is Samsung India Workers Union. Now, the organizations, they don't like the unionization and they don't like formation of unions. So there are two sides of the argument to begin with. When the organizations, they start hiring a workforce, now they feel that once the workers, they unionize, then their ability to work reduces. Because with the slightest of the instigation, they can call for a strike, they can organize sit-in dharnas or protest, and the overall production will be impacted. But if you flip the coin and think from the side of the workers' rights, now the workers, an individual worker, let's suppose, if that individual worker is being oppressed, will that individual worker, will he or she have the might or the power to fight against the might of a large conglomerate like Samsung? Absolutely not. But if these 1,000 workers, they end up forming a kind of a union, and if their working conditions are really bad, if the security is not provided, social security is not provided, if proper healthy conditions are not provided in the factories, if they form a union, that is when they will have a better voice. The concept of collective bargain comes in. And this concept of collective bargain is something which has been in the offing across the globe since the 18th and the 19th, early 19th century itself. That is where the argument for the trade unions have always been upheld by the various courts as well. You see, this is the issue here with Chennai, in the region of the Samsung plant also. Now, what happened after this particular protest? As the protest was going on, there was increased pressure on the state government. So the state government basically formed a workmen committee. Workmen committee to hear about the issues of the workers. Now the workers were not satisfied. The workers wanted their own union. Meanwhile, Samsung India has contested the formation of the union by saying that they are using our names. That is something that is not acceptable to us. The state government and Samsung, both of them have argued that these workers are basically being coerced by CITU, that is trade union, the central trade union that you have, the center of trade unions, CITU, which is a pan-India body. Now, CITU is basically instigating the workers of Sri Perumbudur in order to go on a strike. Now, this is when things came to a precipice, when you had a police action against the protesters. The police basically carried on a lathi charge, and many of the workers have been injured. So that is when you have to understand, and we have to examine that whether this concept of trade unions, which is frowned upon, whether that is really disadvantageous or that has got some amount of weight. So we talk about the aspect of collective bargaining. That is what the trade unions provide. Now you see, when we talk about collective bargaining, it is to provide that weight to the voice of the workers. Individual worker cannot hold any stance against larger corporates. Corporates have a lot of power, money power, political power, etc. But then the collective bargain is something which can achieve worker safety, worker rights, etc. Now this came to light for the first time in the late 18th and early 19th century. When you had the coal miners So that is where the trade unions and the collective bargaining helped the workers' rights, helped achieve the workers' right during the Second World War, during even the economic depression of the 1930s. But we ourselves, we are not new to this concept. In history, you would all have read that in 1918, you had the Ahmedabad mill strike. Ahmedabad mill strike. Now, during this Ahmedabad mill strike, now this is something that you would have studied under the initial movements launched by Mahatma Gandhi, where it starts with Champaran, then you have the Ahmedabad mill strike, Bardoli Satyagraha, all of them are there. Now, in the case of Ahmedabad mill strike, it was at that point of time under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi that a committee was formed, having members from the workers also having their representation and members from the organization or the employer also, the industrialist side also, for which Mahatma Gandhi unfairly has been criticized for a long period of time that he took the side of the industrialist by including them into the committee. But nonetheless, his purpose was to find a solution for the rights of the workers. So we have seen this, that how it has yielded positive results for the workers' rights. Now, when we are independent, we cannot go around, flip our side and say that these trade unions are bad. You see, various different scholars, they have always said that when it comes to workers' rights, that is an absolute important mechanism in industrial development. Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the better presidents of United States, in 1952 had stated that the difference between the workers' rights and not providing them that or denying them that right to unionize and carry out collective bargaining is the difference between democracy and despotism, or in a way, autocracy. So, that is something which has always been included as a part of their right. And it is their right to express their voice, to express their grievances. US Congress in its famous Wagner Act, had stated that this denial of the workers' union to express their collective bargain amounts to unfair trade practice. Unfair trade practice. So you had the Wagner Act in US. So they said that denial of collective bargain is basically between the employer and the employee amounts to unfair practice. Now that in itself is substantial enough. Now what about us in India? In India, under the sections of the Industrial Dispute Act, calling of strikes, calling of bands have been held democratic, or they have been held as legal. Then, our own Act of 1947, the fifth schedule within that, talks about the aspect of collective bargain being denial of collective bargain, again as an unfair practice. This is reinforced by the fifth schedule of the 1947 Act of India's 1947 Act. So unionization is not something which is for the ill of the organization. It is for the welfare of the workers. As you can expect, an issue which is as contentious as this, where the corporate have a different line of thinking and the workers have a different line of thinking altogether, this has reached the doorsteps of judiciary time and time again. This is where the Supreme Court, in its judgment as well as the Madras High Court, has upheld the right of the workers to basically carry out the unions, provided it is for the welfare basis. Now, it is also basically a mention that it is the obligation of the state through the registrar of the trade unions as the regulatory authority under the 1926 Act to register trade unions and give individual workers their voice. So even our own acts, they advocate the formation of trade unions and tells us that it is the duty of the state. Does not need to be backed by a large proceeding. So here they include immunity from both civil and criminal action. If you have formed a union, you will not be prosecuted criminally or under a civil charge. Even 7 members could apply for the registration of their union. That vociferously cements the right for the formation of unions. Now, what were the judgments, the famous judgments? So basically, the landmark judgment, B.R. Singh versus Union of India, there the Supreme Court upheld the right to form unions under the fundamental rights, Article 19(1) Part C. Under Article 19(1) Part C of the Constitution, they said that associations or unions, the formation is a fundamental right. Yes, there are reasonable restrictions which can be imposed under the provisions of Article 19(4). But then these reasonable restrictions, they will be applicable only if there is an issue of public order, morality, sovereignty or integrity of India, not randomly. So that is where it is very much legal. It is allowed. And what the court observed and noted is also very relevant. Because trade unionists, they act as the mouthpieces of labor. They are not carrying out any ill activities. They are carrying out activities for the benefit of the labor force that you have. Then even the Madras High Court in the Rangaswamy versus Registrar of Trade Unions, they basically defined the history and object of the Trade Unions Act as the organization of labor to enable collective bargaining. In fact, even the International Labour Organization, under its Article 2, recognizes collective bargaining as negotiation between employees and employers of their organization to determine working conditions and terms of employment. So collective bargaining has been recognized. Worker unions are legitimate to express the overall interests. So that is where the entire conundrum or the entire controversy created around unionization oftentimes is deemed to be unwarranted. But then these are the intricate details. Now many people say, or many of the advocates of the state government, they have argued that look, this is illegal. The strike calling is illegal. That we have already pointed out, that under the Industrial Dispute Act, it has been held as legal. So then, why that reservation against the entire trade union and the formation of trade unions? So what is the larger issue? The larger issue is that the entire concept of unions has been vitiated by few political interests in certain parts of the country. And we have had a woeful experience because of that. So that is where many of the unions, they became a playground for political parties. So because if you are a leader of the trade union, then to seek more power, many of the times people seek electoral constituencies and votes, and that becomes their own backyard or bastion, and the trade union behaves as per the directives of the political parties. So here, in the way forward, you need politicization of unions. If you are head of a trade union, you cannot be a member of another political party. That can be there, or that should be there. Otherwise, always there is what appears to be a conflict of interest. Then after that, there needs to be a transparent and accountable committee, including the labor commissioner if required, including the members of the employers, the organization, and the workers, to hear out the grievances properly. As much as possible, public hearing should be held. So public hearing of grievances. public hearing of grievances. In case or in those cases where the grievances are deemed to be frivolous, let's suppose there has been strike call only for political interest, then the trade unions should also be liable to punishment. But in case where their working conditions are compromised with, the organization should be fined very, very heavily. So that means there needs to be a transparency in the entire working of the labor professionals itself. Only then that the kind of bad image that the unions have got, that will be shed. Okay, so that is the larger issue and the way forward. So overall in this article, what have we discussed? What is the context? That is, there is a strike by the workers of Samsung Electronics in Sri Perumbudur. What are the issues? Basically the safe working conditions and healthy environment. For that they have staged a protest. Now there has been a workmen committee by the state government which has failed in its negotiations, due to which now there has been police action, lathi charge, and there is a controversy brewing around. Now all the workers want the formation of a trade union or a union like that for the laborers, that is SIWU, and Samsung has contested that they are using the trademark, they are violating the Trademarks Act, which is not the case. Now, also the allegation is that Center for Trade Unions that you have, the central organization, Pan-India organization, that is backing this particular worker protest, which has also been unfounded. Then we have looked at the entire concept of collective bargaining, its evolution, presence in India, across the globe, the norms in US, the norms in India as per the Industries Act, the Industries Dispute Act, the role of the state in order to recognize the trade unions as per the 1926 Act, the various famous judgments which deem the formation of unions as logical, and also why there is a perception against the unions and what needs to be done going ahead. This much is more than sufficient for the entire analysis of this aspect relevant for your GS paper 3. Let us take a look at it with the help of a question. Discuss the role of unions in advancing the workers' rights and briefly mention the criticism leveled against them. This is a 15 marker. So in the intro, you talk about what the unions do. Unions basically are a collective organization representing labor workers in various different areas and voicing their requirements for better terms of employment, better aspect of working condition. Then in the body, after that brief intro, in the body, talk about the concept of collective bargain. Here you can start by Article 2 of the Code of International Labour Organization talks about the collective bargain. That is what you can talk about. What is this? And then how various different acts across the world, they have basically indicated the role of collective bargain, the importance even in 1918 Ahmedabad mill strike, the role during the Second World War, during the 1930s economic depression, all of that can be highlighted here. Okay. Then talk about the factor that they represent the workers' rights as justified by, just name the Supreme Court cases and the Madras High Court case, just name that. Now after that, criticism leveled is increased politicization, lack of productivity. These are some of the criticisms which are leveled. And way forward in the conclusion, the need of the hour is to give voice and recognition to these unions for ensuring better public or better labor conditions, welfare of the workers, but at the same time, it also involves responsible action from the side of the unions, depoliticization being a major action required. Okay. Now, after this, we move to the next article, that is, how did the Haber-Bosch process change the world? Now, Haber-Bosch process talks about manufacturing of fertilizer, ammonia fertilizer in chief. Now here, when we talk about ammonia or such fertilizers, they basically end up providing nitrogen to the plants. You see, plants require certain macronutrients, nutrients which are required for the development of tissues, for furthering their growth, etc. Amongst them, you have nitrogen, then you have phosphate, and then you have potash. Right? N, P, and K. They are required by the plants for the growth. Now here, when we talk about nitrogen, you see, nitrogen is the most abundant gas in our atmosphere. Nitrogen overall is present in a quantity close to around 78 to 79% in our atmosphere. So that is very abundant. But soil across the world, they are poor in nitrogen. Why is that? It is also an understood fact that throughout the evolution of atmosphere, the nitrogen amount has remained largely consistent. Oxygen quantity has increased, oxygen quantity has decreased, carbon dioxide has increased, decreased, etc. But nitrogen has been largely consistent. Now, why is that? So basically, when we talk about the ground surface, let's suppose the rocks. Now, the nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere is present in N2. N2, basically, you have nitrogen molecules and they are joined by the triple bonds. So these triple bonds, it requires a lot of energy to break them. So as a consequence, it is not easily reactive or is non-reactive in N2 form, almost inert. Whereas CO2 can react with the rocks, oxygen can react with the rocks, form rust, etc. But N2 is not reactive. So as N2 is not reactive, so the rocks don't form nitrates. It is the rocks which will disintegrate in order to create or form the nutrients in the soil and form the soil. So basically, if the rocks themselves don't have nitrates, how will the soil have nitrates? So majority of the soil across the world is poor in nitrogen. But nitrogen is an element required by the plants, and you have almost all the soil poor in nitrogen. So here, what happens? Nature has a cure. Basically, nature provides nitrogen, is able to break this bond if, let's suppose, there is a lightning. During a lightning strike, this nitrogen breaks off, right? So that is when some of the nitrogen reacts with oxygen, hydrogen, forms ammonia, nitrous oxide, and then it returns to the soil to be utilized by the plant root nodules. So that is one way. Other, for example, let's suppose we consume nitrogen, other plants and other animals also consume nitrogen. Now in the excreta, some amount of nitrogen is there. In the dead organism, some amount of nitrogen is there. But still that does not manage to fulfill the overall requirement of nitrogen by the plant community. Then you have nitrifying bacterium, microbes, who are able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into NH4, ammonium ions, right, into various different utilizable forms. Then you also have the growth of legumes, leguminous plants. So when we say legumes, we basically mean plants like pulses, peas, etc. In their root nodules, you have these symbiotic microbes which help in nitrification. They convert atmospheric nitrogen into utilizable forms. Now the farmers of the olden times, they knew this. So they would grow a lot of pulses and legumes after every cropping cycle in order to recharge the fertility. But then, with the increasing world population, you needed more amount of nitrogen. And that is when this particular mechanism to produce nitrogen, that is the Haber-Bosch process, that came into prominence. This is to enhance the entire recharge of nitrogen. Now you see that biogeochemical cycle which allows for the entire natural recharge and natural flow of nitrogen. That is what is referred to as the nitrogen cycle. Now, in this nitrogen cycle, if you will observe, you have different coloration patterns. You have the blue ones and the red ones. Red ones are the ones impacted by humans. Blue ones are the natural pathway of cycling and recharge of nitrogen. So here you will see that during electrical storms, volcanic activity, whenever high energy is passed through, nitrogen can break. Nitrification by bacterium, all of them will, during decomposition, all of them will provide ammonia into the soil. Then denitrifying bacterium will provide them back into the atmosphere. Nitrates from fertilizers, etc., they are also provided into the soil. But then this is not enough. So that is when you basically had this process of production of ammonia. Now that is what the article deals with. The production of the nitrogen cycle requirement of the plant and also the Haber-Bosch cycle. So basically what is this? So here, if you understand this, you don't have to rectify the entire cycle. You have to understand that this entire cycle basically was a novel idea in order to heat the mixture of nitrogen and hydrogen to a very high temperature so that ammonia could be attained. But when it was carried out, first of all, it was understood that you need to provide a very high atmospheric pressure, heat it quite significantly, and then you get that gaseous ammonia. But the yield was very less, 1% of the mixture. So could not be used for wider purposes or applications. That is when you had some catalysts such as osmium, uranium, etc., which were devised in order to ensure a better yield and a better reactiveness. Also, another modification which was done was basically use of coolant to convert that ammonia gas into liquid so that there can be greater extraction. But then the role of Carl Bosch, that is the person who was the chief chemist in BASF, the German chemical factory or the large chemical manufacturer. Carl Bosch basically utilized certain iron oxides as a catalyst to trigger the faster reaction rather than osmium and uranium, which were the costly endeavors. He observed that even iron oxide can lead to yielding of ammonia. So since that point of time, the world has witnessed a change with the production of nitrogen on a synthetic manner, that is ammonia rather. Ammonia could then be applied to the soil and the productivity of the plants could increase. So observe this process briefly. Methane water is introduced where there is a reaction, right? Now in this reaction, hydrogen is the byproduct. Now that hydrogen basically becomes available to be reacting with nitrogen which is introduced, right? The air, natural air consists of nitrogen and oxygen. So then you have the formation of N2H2, nitrogen and hydrogen mixture. With the help of the catalyst, here you have the introduction of the catalyst. Then water is introduced. Then basically you have the uniform mixture which is produced. Now the impurities are filtered out at this stage with the help of a scrubber, where the other impurities of the air, they are basically, and even the carbonation is removed. Then after that, after going through compressor, you have N2H2 mixture which passes through a preheater and then it goes through a reactor. Here very high amount of pressure, very high amount of temperature and the use of a catalyst. It is here that earlier Haber had used the and uranium. But these were very, very costly catalysts, could not be available for wider use. That is when Carl Bosch introduced iron oxide, lowering the price point and increasing the amount of yield. So that is where the contribution of Bosch has been. After that, you have the production of ammonia through a heat exchange. It is passed through and then you have the ammonia in the coolant, it is converted into liquid ammonia. So this is where the yield is also very high. So that has been the contribution and the Haber-Bosch cycle. What is this cycle? That is relevant for your exam. Nitrogen cycle is relevant for your exam. Now the advantages of this particular process. What are the advantages? Ammonia could be made available in larger proportions. Ammonia available at cheap price. Cheap price. Right? Then this could augment or increase the crop productivity. Researchers have indicated that this crop productivity, which has been increased on the backdrop of very cheap fertilizers, has managed to feed 2/3 of the world population. So imagine the kind of food scarcity which would have prevailed without this, right? It has allowed for increased farm income as well. Increased farm income. Farm income. Okay? The disadvantage, however, has been that there has been increased loading of nitrogen into the soil, which has proven to be a source of or the factor leading to soil degradation in the long run. So that is where fertilizer utilization has to be judicious and not going to the excessive side of it. Okay? Now, moving to certain articles relevant for your prelims. Now, Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, they have shared the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on wealth inequality. Now, basically, Acemoglu, who is a Turkish American, he is known for his best-selling works such as Why Nations Fail, which is a bestseller out there. Now, they have worked on wealth inequality, where they have taken a look at the relationship between social institutions that you have, the opportunities that a society has. The aspect of inequality has been correlated with that, right? So they have carried out the work in certain areas. For example, one of the unique areas has been in the region of the US-Mexican border. So basically, they have carried out that work in the region of Nogales, city of Nogales. Now, Nogales shares some part of the boundary with US and some part in Mexico. It has been found that the portion in US, the people are more well off. Why? Because they have better opportunities that they can avail. They have better social structure. So this, they have indicated in their work that increased democratization in the society means better opportunities, more options, and a better welfare. So the wealth inequality will reduce with increased democratization. And they have argued that while the poorer countries also nowadays are becoming well off, but the inequalities will remain as long as you don't have stronger social institutions out there. So what do you have to remember out of this? Why they have been granted the Nobel. That is the reason. Okay, the reason that you have and the individuals, that's it. The work on the basis of increased democratization that is required. Then, September retail inflation at 9-month high of 5.5% as food prices rose at 9.2%. Now here, do you have to retain this data? Absolutely not. But you have to understand that why this inflation has risen up. So, after months of low inflation in the month of July, August, the inflation has started hitting the upper circuit, particularly in the case of food inflation. Now, whenever you have very high food inflation, that is in our country particularly, that is on the backdrop of unseasonal rain, excessive amount of rain disrupting the supply due to floods and food wastages. So, during the last month, in the month of September, in the late August as well, there had been increased amount of flooding in the regions of certain areas of Maharashtra, which has destroyed the crop availability. It has also destroyed the food logistics in that area. Then you have global supply chain shocks which are prevalent, where the commodity prices and the fuel prices have skyrocketed owing to the uptick in the war and the escalation in West Asia. So those are the two reasons: international turmoil leading to increased price of fuel and commodity, which will increase the logistics cost, and secondly, the increased amount of agricultural shock due to unseasonal heavy rainfall. Okay. Now, India, Russia discussed training of sailors for polar navigation, development of joint projects. So basically, what India and Russia are trying to do, they are trying to basically bring into materialization the North Sea route. Now you see, as a part of India's commitment to invest in the development of eastern part of Russia, India has invested in the development of the region around Vladivostok. Now there, Russia is also basically thinking of having a viable sea trade, reducing the time taken for transportation of goods between Asia Pacific and Europe significantly by utilizing the region of the Arctic. That is where Rosatom from the side of Russia has been partnering with the government of India to form a memorandum of understanding for utilization of the trade route from Vladivostok into the other parts of Eurasian continent. So that is where, now that is a particular area which is fraught with various different ills, dangers, etc. And that is why the joint training program has been initiated. So for your examination, North Sea route, India and Rosatom from Russia, they are partnering to have a better and a shortened trade between Asia Pacific and Europe. Okay. Now, stubble burning on the rise in Punjab and Haryana, Delhi's air quality dips. Stubble burning. So when you grow a crop like paddy cultivation. Now, paddy or rice is a kharif crop. It is a kharif crop. So it is one of those kharif crops which is sown immediately after the monsoon rains in the month of July. August also sometimes late June, but mostly July, and is harvested in the month of September and October. Now, once that paddy is harvested, they leave behind that very hard, stringent and stiff residue, which is referred to as the stubble. Now, you see, in the regions of Punjab, Haryana and Western UP, the ground has to be, or the farmland has to be prepared for the sowing of Rabi crops, that is the winter crops, in the month of November. So before that, the ground needs to be cleared off. Now the farmers, they basically end up burning this stubble because extracting them altogether requires a lot of manual labor that is costly, and then leaving them like that in the field will take a lot of time for them to get degraded naturally. They don't have that much time. They have to prepare the field for the November sowing or the Rabi sowing. So as a consequence, they end up burning that. Now, even though the amount, now when you burn it, that creates a lot of emissions. You have sulfates, nitrates, you have carbon monoxide, heavy compounds, then you have volatile organic compounds leading to the production of ground level ozone. So the consequences are disastrous. Many parts of northern part of India basically get engulfed in thick smog for majority of the winter due to the stubble burning. So the government has come up with various different types of punitive measures also, punishing measures, where legislations have been passed to criminalize this action on the side of the Punjab and the Haryana government. At the same time, there have been alternatives such as decomposer tablets being released by PUSA or happy seeders, or even when we talk about this particular stubble being utilized by the industry to produce ethanol, to produce the packaging materials, fibers, etc. So, but then the industrial utilization is the way ahead. But that has not been happening with increased pace. Now, even though the amount of wildfires or the fires in the farmland is comparatively less as compared to 2020, but then still in the regions of Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, they have basically got an uptick. So what is the way forward in this case? This keeps on repeating year after year. Way forward is crop diversification. Diversify away from paddy. Anyways, paddy requires so much amount of moisture, due to which these rain deficient areas of western UP, Haryana and Punjab, they have been depleting the groundwater at an alarming rate, at an alarming levels. So that is the required path to be taken ahead. Now, Delhi, the air quality is worsening. So Delhi has instigated the stage 1 of GRAP. GRAP is what? Graded Response Action Plan. So that basically, depending upon the air quality index, various actions are automatically triggered. For example, if the air quality becomes very worse, then entry of heavy vehicles, that gets banned. If it gets more worse, then certain industries are ordered to be shut. Then if it becomes more poorer, you can have the vehicles or the transportation sector being impacted, the schools will be shut down. So that is the Graded Response Action Plan. So that GRAP has been triggered in Delhi owing to the worsening air quality. Okay. Now the last article, the Nile nations agree on water sharing without Egypt's nod. So which are the Nile nations involved? So here basically for the kind of sustainable sharing of and utilization of the water by river Nile by these countries in Africa, that was the purpose here. But Egypt has not been a part of this agreement. Egypt, and if you take a look at it, Sudan, Egypt and Sudan, they basically declined to sign. Now they are saying that they don't agree to any other diversification of river Nile. Now this is stemming from the fact that there has been an ongoing dispute in the region of river Nile. If you observe the region of river Nile, you will observe that countries, right, Uganda, now these are in the upstream. So countries like Egypt, they have always expressed, even Sudan for that matter, reservations against Ethiopia, Uganda, etc., that they are utilizing the Nile waters more. Basically, Ethiopia had built a dam on this Blue Nile River, and that had created a lot of controversy. Blue Nile is a tributary of river Nile. So that had created a controversy where countries like Egypt alleged that they have now been getting less water. So the relation between Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, they have not been good enough. Having said that, other than Egypt and Sudan, and Kenya abstained from that, all the other nations of the Nile riparian basin, they have agreed on sustainable utilization of river Nile. More about this Nile river basin, catch it on the places in news that we come out every alternate Saturday. Now, that brings us to the end of the discussion. I hope the discussion was helpful and you have managed to add some amount to your existing knowledge set. Try to answer the questions on your own, get it evaluated, get the feedback, and attempt the multiple choice question in the Telegram section so that you have an overall assessment. If you have liked this video, please don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.